AMD could actually block the sale of Intel to Broadcom. How crazy is that? But wait, Broadcom is buying Intel? And how the hell could AMD block that? Well, let's backtrack and explain. To be clear, the idea that Intel is going to be bought out is just rumours. Much in the same way that there were endless rumours about AMD being bought out back in their rough days, and now that it's AMD flying high and Intel in the dumps, well, those rumours have flipped. As for Broadcom, again, that's still somewhat rumour mill stuff, although a Wall Street Journal report says that Broadcom has informally discussed with its advisors making a bid, but would likely only do so if it finds a partner for Intel's manufacturing business, which is where the rumour that TSMC would take over Intel's fabs has come from. Well, Broadcom takes the chip designs for themselves. Again, the word, even in that quote, informally, suggests the sincerity of this, but the actual sale isn't the most interesting part here. That would be the fact that AMD could sink any deal to buy Intel. So how the hell does that work? Well, to properly understand that, we need to look back at how it came to be that we have only two x86 CPU makers. To be pedantic, there is actually three: AMD, Intel, and Zhaoxin, formerly VIA, although the latter really only sells in-house in China, and at least by comparison seems to lag behind in performance and capabilities, who themselves only acquired an x86 license by buying Cyrix, but for this story they aren't all that important. The first CPU that Intel made was the 4004, a whopping 4 bytes and a massive clock speed of 750 kHz. For context, just in clock speed alone, a modern Intel chip like the 285K is 7,600 times faster than the 4004. That's just insane. Anyway, that was pretty basic, although for 1971 it was still pretty sweet. It took until 1978 for Intel to make their first x86 chip, the 8086. These were 16-bit chips, and significantly, this was the first Intel chip with microcode. We'd likely just call that firmware today, but it's basically software that is built into the chip itself that means that you can alter how the chip works after building it. And importantly, it also counted as copyrightable software, not just patentable hardware. Even more importantly, in 1980, Intel secured a deal with IBM to be the chip vendor for the one, the only, the IBM PC. The big problem with that deal is that back then, the sorts of people who bought microprocessors, people like IBM, required chip makers to offer a second source chip maker alongside the first source. In this case, that'd be Intel. That was partly due to silicon manufacturing space, or the space in general, being incredibly limited and therefore difficult to meet demand, and partially as a redundancy precaution in case the first source chip maker went bust or stopped making the chip they needed. Luckily for Intel, AMD, founded by another ex-Fairchild employee, Jerry Sanders, had already been second sourcing Intel products, including the 8080. AMD called their slightly improved version the 9080, with a full cross-licensing agreement in 1976, which was then extended in 1982 for another 10 years to help Intel fulfill their 8086 and 8088 chip contracts with IBM. Unfortunately, things went downhill pretty quickly after that. AMD happily second-sourced Intel's 8186 and 8286, but Intel felt that they were getting the short end of the stick in this arrangement, as AMD was getting all these high-tech, well-selling CPUs, and Intel was getting peripheral chips with no major sales volume. By 1985, Intel was ready to launch the much improved 8386, known as the 386, which I'll stick from now on, which was a pretty significant leap forward in performance, especially thanks to it being a 32-bit chip. It found its way into IBM PC clones like the Compact Desk Pro, which sold incredibly well, and since IBM had moved manufacturing of their own 286 clone in-house and weren't all that interested in the 386, Intel opted to purposefully not offer a second source option. Considering AMD still had that 10-year deal, less than 3 years old at that point, AMD took Intel to the forced arbitration included in the contract. Intel responded by terminating the agreement with 1 year's notice. The arbitration took a grueling 5 years, but in the end, Intel was found to have breached the contract. AMD quickly moved to sell their own 386 clone, the AM386, but through what I can only describe as the most amazing cover story or the most insane coincidence, Intel found out that AMD were launching the AM386 early and sued them to try and halt production. Basically, Intel's story is that 2 different Mike Webbs were staying at the same Sunnyvale Hilton hotel at the same time. One from AMD, the director of marketing, and one from Intel, a standard engineer. And when AMD sent confidential information to their Mike Webb, well, the hotel gave it to the wrong one and gave those documents to the Intel Mike, not the AMD one. That's Intel's story, although AMD struggled to believe that and suspected foul play or outright espionage. Regardless, a judge ruled that 386 was a generic term not protected by copyright, and therefore AMD could finally bring their 386 clone to the market, a full 6 years after Intel's original chip. Amazingly, this is what caused Intel to ditch straight chip numbers and switch to names, with the 386 being quickly renamed to the i386 so it could be copyrighted, and just 2 generations on they swapped from numbers entirely to a name you're probably pretty familiar with: Pentium. That wasn't the end of the litigation, oh god no. AMD and Intel sued each other 6 times in the 1990s, with Intel suing AMD in 1991 and 93 over microcode copyright infringement in AMD's ATC287 math coprocessor, along with the AM386 and AM486 respectively. That is significant because in 1989, another Intel lawsuit against NEC, a judge ruled that microcode was software and therefore was copyrightable, even though NEC's V20 and V30 chips didn't actually violate that copyright, meaning Intel technically lost that suit, but kind of won the war, as the decision would be, well, kind of imperative for their fight against AMD. AMD sued Intel in 91 with a federal antitrust case claiming Intel was trying to create a monopoly, and again in 92 under California's unfair competition laws because, and I can't believe Intel had the gall to do this, they were demanding that the buyers of the AM386 and AM486 chips had to pay Intel patent royalties. Like, what the hell, Intel? That's both a big brain and a big cojones move. In 95, both teams decided enough was enough and settled their cases, with Intel paying AMD $18 million for a breach of contract and AMD paying Intel $58 million for patent infringement. In the midst of all their battling, Intel launched their Pentium lineup starting in 1993 and later the Pentium MMX chips in 96. These chips are a pretty big leap forward again. The 46 chips introduced a feature called pipelining, which is an attempt to keep the whole chip busy at once by adding parallelism to the chip's operation. Instead of one operation blocking access to the whole chip, each part of the chip, fetch, decode, execute, etc., is able to operate simultaneously. So instruction 1 runs its fetch command on the first clock cycle, then 1 clock cycle on, that first instruction takes that fetch data and starts decoding, while the next instruction in the queue starts its fetch. The next cycle, instruction 1 gets executed, while instruction 2 gets decoded, and a third one gets fetched. That cycle repeats for every stage, meaning instead of having to wait for instruction 1 to fetch, decode, execute, access memory, and write out the result before the next instruction can start anything, you get way more throughput per cycle, meaning the chip is way faster. Pentium introduced an upgrade to this, which is basically, or it's called superscalar, basically taking the idea of pipelining to the next level by executing 2 instructions at the same time with 2 different execution units. For context, Intel's latest Arrow Lake chips, at least the performance cores anyway, have a total of 18 execution ports. The Pentiums had one main pipeline and a simpler pipeline, meaning that in most cases it could handle 2 operations per cycle. Again, that was a pretty big leap forward. AMD, on the other hand, already half a decade late to the party, couldn't directly compete with these new Pentium chips, at least on the design front. Funnily enough, AMD were actually ahead of Intel in the nanometer game, sound familiar? And brought out a 500nm, then 350nm version of their AM486 and called it the DX4. That was actually faster than the early Pentiums, despite being a considerably older chip. That did give AMD some breathing room to create their Pentium class chip, the K5, in '96. The K5 changed the game entirely, such that we still use its core design philosophy today, that being UOPs or micro-operations. Basically, each x86 instruction the chip is sent gets split up into RISC instructions that the CPU then acts on. You might have heard of RISC before, but only in the context of ARM or RISC-V chips, with RISC standing for Reduced Instruction Set Computing rather than x86's CISC or Complex Instruction Set Computing. This simplifies the chip design into a smaller set of base instructions with a front-end component that handles the CISC to RISC conversion. That was a huge step forward, meaning AMD's K5 chips, even at lower clock speeds, were faster than the Pentiums in almost every workload. Except Quake, with its weird floating point stuff that favoured the Pentium. Intel responded with the Pentium Pro, which also featured UOPs, along with a bunch of other features, including on-chip level 2 cache, a physical address extension or PAE, which is basically what lets you address more than 4GB of RAM, just to name a few. It was amazing for the time, albeit it flew a little too close to the sun because it struggled to run 16-bit code, something that Windows 95 and 98, along with like every game available at the time, was riddled with, making it seem like a less than impressive bit of kit. AMD, on the other hand, bought out Next Gen and rebranded what they'd been working on as their new K6 chip, which at least fixed the floating point performance so Quake ran well. Intel's second go at the Pentium Pro, the Pentium 2, was better with 16-bit code, and here's where we start to see Intel taking more aggressive anti-consumer and anti-competitor moves. They put the damn CPU on a proprietary card. Before the Pentium 2, any socket 4 chip would work in any socket 4 motherboard, be that Intel, AMD, Cyrix, Next Gen, whoever. If it fits, it sits. Wait, no, that's CAT. If it fits, it works. Hell, Intel would even sell you overdrive versions of their newer chips to fit in your older boards. They were fully, they were that compatible. But Intel wanted a way to shut out everyone else, including AMD, so they split the market. If you wanted a Pentium 2, you had to buy a slot 1 motherboard. This is where we also start to see Intel offering multiple SKUs of their own products, not just newer versions that effectively make the older ones outdated and therefore bring the price down, but purposefully lower spec versions of their newest, hottest products. Enter Celeron. This is also where Xeon comes in. This is a slightly higher spec version of the main chip, mostly focused on the server market. Clearly though, Intel didn't think too far ahead with slot 1, so they created slot 2 to accommodate things like multi-processor configurations for the server market, further frustrating motherboard makers. AMD opted to follow that with the K6-3, which introduced the 3-level cache we know and love today, and that Intel has actually just moved away from with their new 4 levels of cache, and segmented their own product line with the Duron. We're in 2000 now, so at least we're, in this century, hallelujah. In 2001, AMD launched the Athlon, which was considerably faster than the Pentium 3 in basically all regards, while still being cheaper. Needless to say, the Athlon was a big success for AMD. Unsurprisingly, Intel struggled getting their 250nm process node to work, although later did refine the Pentium 3 with their Coppermine and Tualatin architectures at 180 and 130nm respectively. And we're just about to be, absolutely light money on fire with the now infamous Itanium chips. Itanium was the first 64-bit option from, anyone, and featured a bunch of new architecture changes like EPIC, explicitly parallel instruction computing, and VLIW, or very long instruction word. Basically, you could pass a bundle of instructions to the processor, which would then run the whole bundle in parallel. The problem with that is that you need the software to be explicitly compiled with this in mind. The software needs to be able to bundle the right set of instructions together and send it off to the CPU rather than the usual queue. The problem? Well, no one, not even Intel, could make a compiler that could actually do that well. So, while potentially good in theory, in practice, well, let's just say it was poor. Even more hilariously, Intel actually had a deal with HP to provide Itanium chips until at least 2017, with the last deliveries being in 2021. So Intel has been burning cargo ships worth of money every year, keeping this titanic failure afloat. They once predicted up to $38 billion a year in revenue from Itanium servers, but the actual figures are just woof. AMD, on the other hand, played it much smarter. They didn't try and reinvent the wheel. They just spruced it up with a little 64-bit magic. Enter x86 64 or AMD 64, an updated 64-bit version of x86 or Intel 386 as it's often called. These chips were fully compatible with 8 1632-bit code, along with 64-bit of course, and considering the choice between a completely backwards compatible chip family or something that was practically dead on arrival, well, it was an obvious choice to opt for the Opteron. Pun intended. Intel saw the writing on the wall here and tucked their tail between their legs and politely asked AMD if they could license AMD's new instruction set to be able to build the Pentium 4 and later Celeron and Pentium D families. Amazingly, at least according to Passmark, in 2006 AMD had an all-time high 48.4% market share in the desktop processor market. That's still 10% higher than even today with their Ryzen dominance, albeit that doesn't include the Core Ultra versus 9800X3D from late last year, early this year. AMD was on fire. This is also when dual-core CPUs really hit the market, with Intel's Pentium D, a dual-core Pentium 4, and the Athlon 64X2. Although, in a beautiful piece of irony, the Pentium D was actually just 2 Pentium 4 dies on one substrate, whereas the Athlon X2 was a proper dual core, as in both cores on one piece of silicon, one die. Oh, how the times have changed. Naturally, the Athlon X2 was more performant, but it was also more expensive too, compared to the cheaper but slower Pentium D. The even funnier thing was that Intel was really only staying in the game by bumping up the clock frequencies over and over and over, trying to keep up with AMD. So for the next wave of chips, they knew they had to do something different. And different they did. They stole Transmeta's dynamic clock frequency and voltage tech. Seriously, Transmeta, one of the other x86 CPU makers from the early 2000s, invented the whole turbo boost clock and voltage behavior thing. And while most people licensed the design from them, Intel just straight stole it. Transmeta sued Intel and in 2007 settled for $250 million, which in today's money is, well, not far off double at $383 million. Anyway, they took the core design from the mobile version of the Pentium 3, the front-side bus from the Pentium 4, and the stolen speed step tech, and turned it into the Core and Core Duo. At the same time, AMD seemed to be a little too comfortable up on that perch, and spent all of their R&D money on acquiring a little video card company called ATI. This wasn't the best time for AMD to spunk all their money, because Intel swiftly launched the Core 2 Duo, which AMD's offerings just couldn't keep up with. AMD pumped the clock speeds up again to a little success, especially when, well, Intel just dropped the absolute bombshell that was the Core 2 Quad, a quad-core version of their already successful Core 2 design. AMD did attempt to compete with the Phenom line, including the Phenom 2 X4 and later the X3 and X6 versions. Fun fact about those parts, especially the 3-core ones, is that the very early versions had a potentially amazing feature that you could re-enable 1, 2, or all 3 of the missing cores right in the BIOS. Basically, the way that sort of like product segmentation generally works is that the big silicon wafers aren't perfect, and the individual dies that make up those wafers can have defects. Some are outright just buggered, useless, ready to be put in the bin, no use at all, but some of them have more minor defects in, say, just one core. So AMD test the dies, find that it has a broken core, and then they disable 2, 3, or however many of those cores and sell it as a lower end part, therefore saving that bit of silicon from the bin. Now, the proper way to disable those cores is to laser them off from the rest of the chip. But I guess AMD forgot to do that, meaning they just disabled them in software, so enterprising nerds could re-enable them after the fact. Now, there's a good chance that they were disabled for a good reason, but some reported that they bought an X3 and unlocked it to a seemingly fully functional X6, and that seemed like a killer deal at the time. Sadly for AMD, even the Phenom X6 couldn't really keep up with Intel's Sandy Bridge chips. The Core i7-2700K in particular was just incredible. This is the start of the dark days for AMD, as their market share slipped to just over a quarter, 27.2% according to Passmark, and that's only the beginning. AMD struggled pretty heavily on the financial front, so in 2009 opted to do the unthinkable. Sell off their fabs. At the start of 2009, AMD spun off their own foundries into global foundries. Mubadala, the investment fund of Abu Dhabi, the capital of the United Arab Emirates, pumped $700 million into AMD to buy a majority share in their foundry business, with $1.2 billion of AMD's debt being transferred to global foundries, freeing up AMD to, at least in theory, come up with something brilliant. Sadly, they didn't. Their FX lineup, starting with Bulldozer, was a disaster, sending AMD on a death spiral. But unlike most of the other, important but financially ruined companies, AMD couldn't be bought out and saved. Why? Well, that's the key thing we're here, and the key thing of this story comes to. When AMD sold their fabs off, Intel got their knickers in a twist about AMD sub-licensing Intel's proprietary technology and property without consent. Because GlobalFoundries were no longer direct subsidies of AMD, although they were at least initially still a minority owner, Intel saw that as a breach of contract and breach of the peace and started being, well, rather feisty. By November of 2009, AMD and Intel had struck a new patent cross-licensing agreement, which allowed AMD indefinite access to Intel's patents, namely the original x86 architecture, and allowed Intel access to AMD's patents, namely AMD 64. Sounds great, right? Well, there's a few kill shots in there, with the primary of which being clause 5.2. That describes the different reasons the agreement would be automatically terminated. Obviously, a breach of contract would be one, but bankruptcy is, and importantly here, change of control is two. That means that if either company were to be bought out, the agreement is automatically terminated. That one clause is credited as basically the sole reason AMD was never bought out during their decade of barely scraping by, because any buyer would have had to either immediately fight Intel on patents, or at least, or so I guess at best, strike a new cross-licensing deal with them, which was not a sure thing and Intel could rip their eyes out. Intel likely wanted that clause initially because they were the Goliath in the market and saw AMD's dire state and wanted to give them a little poison pill just to be sure. But now it may well be coming back to bite them. If Broadcom and TSMC want to buy and split up Intel, they would have to negotiate with the new champion, AMD, and that isn't a sure thing either. AMD, with its newfound might, could very well squeeze the comparatively struggling Intel and block any potential deals. While I personally don't think that they would, I'm sure they would rather leverage their position to get a very favourable deal out of it and avoid having to deal with antitrust monopoly lawsuits. It is technically a possibility, and that's kind of mad considering where AMD was just a decade ago. From death's doorstep to the top CPU maker. Well, I guess trading places with Qualcomm, at least in market share anyway, albeit different markets. But it will yet to be seen if Intel can regain their throne or if the current woes are sort of an AMD-esque death spiral. I don't think that Intel is anywhere near in as dire of a state as AMD was in the 2010s, so it feels a little premature to be discussing buyouts for them, but if nothing else, I hope you've enjoyed learning about the history as much as I did while writing this video. So, that is at least a somewhat brief summary of the history between Intel and AMD and how either side have potentially held the sword over the neck for either company. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. If I got anything wrong, which is very likely, I'm human and an idiot, feel free to let me know in the comments down below too. If you want to see more videos kind of like this one, hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell notification icon, and you can check out plenty of other videos on the end cards as well. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. We'll see you all in the next video.